The housing crisis in America has reached a dangerous and critical tipping point because more families now are not just downsizing, but they are being forced to move into RVs. And the crazy thing is, RVs used to be a symbol of freedom and retirement. You know, people that owned RVs in the past were people that had a bunch of leisure time and disposable income to travel the country as they please. But now an RV is kind of like the symbol of last resort for people who have nowhere else to go. It's like one step away from being homeless. And the most worrying part about this is that the number of people who are choosing to live in RVs now as the last affordable housing option are exploding. Recent survey data shows that about 500,000 Americans now live in RVs full time, which is more than double what it was just a few years ago. A third of them are actually raising children in these RVs, and most of them make less than $75,000 a year. So it's not really a lifestyle choice. It is the only choice in order to have a comfortable home that they can afford. These are people who are on fixed incomes. These are disabled veterans. These are single parents trying to get by. Here's one woman, for example, who's doing this, who used to be running a successful daycare business in Oregon, and she was paying $2,000 a month in rent. But after a medical emergency and an eviction, she and her kids now live in a 175 square foot RV. They park at campgrounds when they can afford it, and when they can't, they live off grid, bathing themselves in rivers and conserving water and moving every 2 to 3 weeks. Or here's another example of an older woman who sold her house in Kentucky in order to be closer to her family. But by the time she looked for a new place, prices had soared. And instead of taking on a crushing mortgage in retirement, she bought a $29,000 RV and now pays $550 a month at an RV park. And today I'm walking down Bonita Drive, and pretty soon I'll head down to downtown Sausalito over here on Caledonia Street and walk along over there. There's another older guy that they talked to who is retired, and he could not find an apartment for rent under $1,200 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he lives. So he bought an older RV with his savings, and his shower doesn't work and his fridge barely works. And the thing is, living in an RV sounds cheaper at first, but there are a lot of hidden costs to owning these RVs that a lot of people in this situation don't really consider and find out the hard way once it's too late. Very similarly to people who buy homes and find out the hard way that, wait a minute, there's a lot of additional expenses here that I wasn't accounting for. Like, for example, RVs need repairs. You know, they're not built for full-time living. So you have air conditioning, plumbing, and appliances that fail more often because they're being used to death on a full-time basis as a full-time home. So unless it's something that's completely retrofitted to be more robust for full-time living, there's a good chance that these things can fail at a much higher rate than they would in a traditional home. Then, of course, there is debt. If you decide to finance your RV, which it looks like at least nobody in this story did who bought one out of desperation, but if you do, you know, they depreciate fast just like any other vehicle, and you can be easily upside down on your payments where that RV is now worth less than what you owe on it, just like being upside down on a mortgage. You also have a lot of instability because a lot of campgrounds, for example, they usually limit stays to about 14 days. And after that, you're forced to move. So even if you can afford to stay in a campground, which will give you at least water and electrical hookups and a place to take a shower, if your RV doesn't have one, you're limited to 2 weeks before you got to hunt for another one. But a lot of people, honestly, they can't even afford to stay in campgrounds full time anyways, because that has gotten expensive too. And of course, there's no stability for the children, people who are raising kids in these RVs, if they have to be moving around all the time. I mean, it's almost impossible to have them go to a school because you pretty much are limited to staying in the area. And if you're just floating around in the RV, that's going to make it very hard to stay in the area consistently while always having a fresh place to go. But it's not all bad. There are some benefits to doing this, and at least it does pay off in some way. Like, for example, the kids, they spend a lot more time outdoors and off the phones and off the tablets since they're always outdoors, basically surrounded by nature, you know, in a campground or parking on public lands, whatever it is. And then people also foster a sense of community in these RV parks because a lot of people are in similar situation. And as we know, misery loves company, and people can relate to each other. And really the best benefit to it is that people get financial relief. That's why they're doing this to begin with. You know, having the RV lifestyle puts people in a situation where they can finally take a breath of fresh air and be able to pay the bills, be able to pay down debt, and possibly even start building up their savings again so they can get into a more stable and desirable living situation. But this is a worrying trend because ever since 2019, the number of Americans living in RVs, vans, or boats has risen 41%. You see that a lot here in Sausalito too. I walk down all of these marinas with you guys, and a lot of them are just regular sailboats that are out there parked. So many people live on those sailboats, guys. They're very small. You know, you got to be able to live on the water where it's constantly moving. So if you get motion sickness like me, it's not going to be for you. But it is cheap. But it's not a surprise when you look at what's happened with real estate. You know, home prices have exploded far beyond what the median income can afford these days. Like I reported to you last week, only about 30% of the homes on the market for sale are actually affordable for the median income home buyer these days. And of course, all of the housing advocates will just tell you, well, we're just short homes. We just need to build more houses. You know, we need an extra 3 to 4 million homes in this country in order to make up for it and meet demand where it's at. But in reality, what we see happen is when home prices start to fall, like right now, literally half of the country is experiencing home price declines right now. And when this happens, home builders start to retreat. They start to pull back because their profit margins start to shrink as home prices come down and the demand is not as high like we're seeing right now. And ultimately, there's not as much money to be made for the home builders. So what do? They pull back and they don't build as many homes. So instead, what do our policymakers do? Well, they rush in order to backstop the system. And as soon as the home prices start to fall, not only do the home builders walk away, but also lenders start to tighten up credit. They kind of put the housing market into a frozen state. I mean, just look at the data. Mortgage delinquencies are rising, not just among the subprime borrowers, but among middle-class families too. We have 15.3% of pending sales fall through as of the July 2025 numbers, which is the highest cancellation rate on record. And housing starts dropped about 10% and permits by even more as builder confidence sinks to its lowest level since 2012, which was the aftermath of the GFC. And to give you an example of how the home builders walk away from the market when the going gets tough, like right now, KB Homes, well, they just canceled about 10,000 lots because the expected returns were not high enough. And it's not about land and it's not about zoning. It's about a financial system that only works if the prices keep going up. You know, that's all they want. They want prices for homes to keep going up. Government wants it. Home builders want it because that's where the money's at. The government gets higher property taxes and the home builders make higher profits. And instead of letting prices fall, what do? They come in with all sorts of shenanigans to try to keep prices propped up. You know, we have the 30-year mortgage is the longest limit that you can get right now for a mortgage, right? But if you have an FHA loan and you have a hard time paying, you can get extended to a 40-year mortgage right now. So that's going to become the norm sooner than later. You can get a mortgage that's backed by some type of crypto these days. You have rent and utility payments that are now used for credit scores. You can raise the SALT deduction like they just did with the big, beautiful bill so wealthy households can more easily afford expensive homes. They also extend loans to people who really can't afford them. They make qualifying for a loan even easier for low-income households, sometimes even with 0% down payments, just to get people through the door buying homes that they truly can't afford. And they know that they can't afford it. They're doing this on purpose because that's the only way to keep things moving. And here's the perfect example of what I mean. In Jacksonville, Florida, just about a week ago, the NACA, which is a HUD-approved nonprofit, just held an event to get as many people approved for a mortgage as possible within just one day. That sounds like a good thing, right? But here's the kicker. Everybody that they were approving, there's no credit check required. There's no down payment required. There's also no mortgage insurance required. So they're basically giving people a free house, and then you just start making the payments just like you do when you're a renter. That sounds like a great way to stimulate the housing market, especially when home sales are at 30-year lows now, doesn't it? I mean, the fact that they don't even check your credit, guys, is kind of unbelievable. And they claim that the foreclosure rate on these type of loans is actually less than 1%. But I'd be willing to bet that that is a doctored figure as well, because I'm sure that every time one of these people that gets one of these loans falls into hardship, they probably come to the rescue and help them out with their payments, just like the FHA is doing for 2 million borrowers right now. So when you see stuff like this, you know it's all fake. And the thing that I find very interesting is, even though this is the worst housing market we've seen in over 30 years now, even with all of these shenanigans, these financial hula hoops that the government plays and these nonprofits do in order to try to keep the show on the road, it's still not enough to keep things moving. We are still seeing year-over-year sales declines. We're still seeing the highest amount of home contract cancellations ever recorded, even though they're pumping all this stimulus into keeping the housing market afloat, which honestly, I'm very happy to see. You know why? Because finally, the real economy is starting to show its face, regardless of how much artificial stimulus is pumped into it. You know, for the longest time, pretty much since 2008 up until present day, the government has been able to come in and rescue us, along with help from the Fed, by lowering interest rates and performing quantitative easing and making it easier for people to get loans. But now, even with all of that going on, it's not enough anymore to turn things around. They have created such a large mess that it's just not enough. And maybe, just maybe now, we're going to finally start living in the real world economy of how things are really supposed to work. And here's what I mean about home builders. Take a look at this. The Sun Belt housing markets are so weak right now that home builder Lennar, their average home price is now down 22%. And what have I always told you guys? I said that if home prices were to come down by 20% or more within a 5-year period, that to me is considered a housing crash. Well, guess what? New home prices have now come down by 22% in less than 5 years. So the new home market is officially in crash territory by my standards. And the crazy thing is, the prices are likely to continue falling well into 2026 as well, because all the fundamentals that have caused these major price declines have not been fixed. We're still facing all the same problems. Unaffordability is still at an all-time high. On the most recent earnings call with Lennar, the CEO, Stuart Miller, he told the analysts that Lennar will pull back just a little bit on its sales over margin strategy after seeing profitability erode further in the third quarter of this year. He says that even though mortgage rates began to trend downwards at the end of the quarter, stronger sales have not yet followed, and we have certainly begun to see early signs of greater customer interest, but it's just the right time for us to pull back just a little bit. You see what I mean? As soon as the going gets tough for home builders, they pull back. They don't come in and build more homes. They try to have incentives to build more homes because they say, well, their profit margins are too small, so we need more tax credits and more incentives to build in areas and increase the housing density and all of this, which is all good for them. Right now, Lennar's average selling price, net of incentives, fell to $383,000 in Q3 of 2025, which is down 9.2% from the same quarter last year and down a whopping 22% from the peak of home prices back in 2022 when they were selling the same houses for $491,000. Guys, think about that. Going from $491,000 to $383,000 in the span of just 3 years, not even 5 years. That is a major home price crash. And then you still have like these people at the National Association of Realtors, Lawrence Yun, talking about how everything is just fine and that we're not going to see a 2008 style housing crash. Well, newsflash, Lawrence, we are already seeing the 2008 style housing crash play out right now in the new home market and in many existing home markets across America. At this point, these guys are just in denial, saying that it's not happening and refusing to acknowledge the facts. And just to show you how bad this is, take a look at this chart going back to Q3 of 2018, Lennar's average selling price net of incentives is actually lower today than it was back in 2018, guys. And guess what? Back in 2018, we didn't have raging inflation. So when you adjust these numbers down for inflation, a brand new house is cheaper now than it has been at least in the last 10 years. When adjusted for inflation, not nominally, but even nominally, it is cheaper than it was in 2018. That is just wild when you think about it. So home prices nominally for brand new homes have already crashed by 22%, but adjusted for inflation, that number is probably somewhere upwards of 30, 40%. And they're saying that it just couldn't happen again this time, even though it's happening right now. In fact, Lennar's incentives averaged 14.3% of the final sales price last quarter, which is also the highest level since 2009, which means they have to put more icing on the cake than they've had to since 2009 to get homes sold. And everybody remembers what was happening back then. Oh yeah, right, we're in the middle of a major housing crash, kind of like now. The only real difference this time, if you ask me, is there's just a lot more levers that the government is pulling to try to make things look better than they really are. Paying 2 million people's FHA delinquent loans is a perfect example of it. So on a $450,000 home, that works out to about $64,000 in concessions that Lennar is giving right now. And if you just look at this bar graph here of incentives in order to get these homes sold going back to 2009, you can see we're not quite at 2009 levels yet, but we are definitely getting there, and we're already past 2011 and 2010 levels of incentives to get these homes sold. And you can clearly see the direction of this trend is nowhere but up. So it's no wonder that home builders like Lennar are starting to pull back and not build as many homes now. They say that Florida is obviously one of the hardest hit areas, which is really the hardest hit area of the entire country right now when it comes to home sales being in the toilet and prices coming down. But somehow they still believe that if mortgage rates were to just come in below 6%, that would be enough to spark affordability once again and get people back out there to buy homes. Like, clearly these guys are delusional. I mean, I think we could see mortgage rates come back down to even the 2 or 3% that we saw during the pandemic. That might get a few more people off the sidelines and increase affordability a little bit. But honestly, I don't even see that being the magic wand solution to getting home sales back to pre-pandemic levels. It's just not enough, guys. The prices are too high, and the costs to maintain a home and to just keep it are too high now. That's something that wasn't really much of a problem until the last few years. I mean, people have to worry more now about property taxes and insurance and the maintenance around the house than they actually have to worry about affording the home to begin with. If you buy the house, that's the easy part, especially if you get one of these low-income programs or nonprofit programs where you come in with no money down, essentially. That's the easy part. Paying for the house after you own it, that's a whole nother story. And I think thanks to channels like mine, more and more people are starting to realize that and are taking a more serious look at what owning a home really costs before jumping into it. And one of my viewers, Julie, she wrote me an email from Ohio saying that she has been closely tracking the market over there for several years in areas like Richmond, Akron, and Dayton, Ohio. She's been using spreadsheets, keeping track of prices, days on the market, price reductions, things like that. And she's been noticing the price decline spreading from the Richmond, Ohio area into previously strong markets like Akron, which has recently seen sharp drops in prices. And she's seeing a lot of the same things that I see here in California and in Florida, where the sellers still haven't caught up with the program yet and are still listing the home prices way too high. And you just have this accumulation of inventory and homes sitting on the market. So even the Midwest, which has been a very big stronghold for real estate, is starting to crack. And I think the Northeast will be last, but eventually everywhere is going to start seeing year over year negative home price declines, just like we're seeing in California, just like we're seeing in Florida and many other areas across the country. Since Julia has been tracking this for a while now, she thinks the best strategy is for her and her husband to wait for the foreclosures to start coming out, and then she's going to start buying up some real estate. And that's kind of the smart thing that everybody does when we go through these cycles. So many people made a fortune the last time around when we had a housing crash. and you could buy homes for pennies on the dollar. Anybody who was smart before the crash and saved and invested their cash and have just been on the sidelines waiting was able to turn around and buy 5 or 6 or more rental properties after the crash and get rich and build a retirement income. And it sounds like that's what Julie and her husband are doing. So congratulations to you guys for being patient and diligent and observant of your local market and realizing that the time to pounce is getting closer. So you know the housing crisis is getting real, guys, when not even all these government incentives are enough to get people back into homes, and we have a record number of people now living in RVs rather than houses. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here, and I'll see you in the next one.